Okay.
Hi there. My name is Donald Kounovsky. I was born in 1937 in Hillsboro, North Dakota. So in this video, we'll talk a few things about what I did in life.
And it's February 28th, 2025 today.
Correct. That's today's date. So we'll start this out with in 1958 and 59, I worked at Red River Lanes in Fargo. That was, of course, I was single at that time, but they had lots of bowling leagues, and my wife, Lorraine, bowled with a team from Gate City Savings. They used to come on Thursday afternoon after work, and they would bowl between that time and the 7 o'clock leagues that would come in. So there weren't that many people around. I got to visiting with her and found out she was from Portland. So I said, well, I have an aunt that lives in Portland. Her name is Hazel Johnson, and she taught school in. So, of course, Lorene said she knew her, she knew Hazel, and Hazel had even taught Sandy in school. So that got to be a connection. So as time went on, why then she'd come bowling and I would help her bowl, things like that. So that's how that all turned out. So then in October of 1960, we were married, and I worked at the bowling alley and also Siouxland Packing in West Fargo because the bowling alley didn't pay as much as Siouxland Packing, so I actually worked two jobs for a little while as I talked about building the bowling alley in Ashley. And at that same time, I joined the Air National Guard in Fargo. So I got enlisted there in 1961 and went to basic, and came back that summer and then put together everything to go to Ashley to build the bowling alley. And while we were in Ashley, of course, we were closed in the summertime, so I talked to somebody about spraying trees in shelter belts. The USDA used to plant a lot of shelter belts that had to be maintained to meet the government payments. So there was a chemical that you could spray right over the trees when they were little that would kill the weeds and not the trees. So I did that for the first summer that we were in Ashley to keep busy and make some extra money, that sort of thing. And then in January of 19...
Can you talk, you told me a story one time about getting so sick after spraying.
Oh, yeah. There was one time we were out spraying, and I had a gentleman that we put a sprayer on his pickup to help me. And the pickup I had was an old International, and the exhaust pipe had fallen off. It was late in the afternoon, and we wanted to finish up a certain deal. So I was in the cab of this truck. I kind of had the windows open, but the other fellow was up in the tank trying to suck out all the last solutions and things like that. So I sat in the truck and took in a lot of this exhaust fumes. And when we finished, I said, gee, I don't really feel very good. Don't want to drive this truck back to Ashley. We were about 30 miles from Ashley. So I got in his truck and we started going back, and I was so sick I had to have him stop and lay out in the ditch, and finally we got back to Ashley, and that was a guard weekend, so I should have got ready to go to the guard, but I was so sick I went to bed and I didn't wake up till the next morning. So maybe that's the reason I have some forgetfulness now, all that gas that was put through my brain at that time. And after well, then we left Ashley and moved to Fargo.
Well, when you were in Ashley, do you want to talk just a little bit? Didn't Mom help you a lot at the bowling alley? Didn't she run the lunch counter and all that kind of stuff?
Oh yeah. Lorene was at the lunch counter. It was just a small lunch counter. You served some sandwiches and hamburgers and things like that. And Gail Hernett, who was the bank president at that time, came in and wanted a fried egg sandwich, and Lorene, I don't think had ever made one, but she made one up and didn't fry the eggs hard. And I remember him sitting there, and this yolk was running down his sandwich, and we kind of wondered what kind of a cook this young lady was that was at the lunch counter. But she helped there, so that in the afternoon we had a gal that ran the lunch counter, and then at night Lorene would come because I was there and she was home. And then in January of '94, that's when Bart was scheduled to be born. That was on December 2nd, and Lorene said we better go to the hospital. I think it was about 10 o'clock at night. And of course, not very far to the hospital. We got over there, and there was one nurse on duty, and the doctor, of course, wasn't on duty. So they said, well, you're going to have to drive out here about 5 miles in the country to get another nurse. So I drove out there and picked up this gal, brought her back to the hospital, of course. And then Bart was born, I think, somewhere around 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning. And of course, at that time, you didn't go in the delivery room or anything, but they brought Lorene out and, of course, brought the baby out. So I looked at Bart and waited around a few minutes, went home and went to bed, because that was the way you did it back in those days. You didn't have an extra bed in the room to sleep in and wait and all the hoopla that goes with it today. So that's how Bart was brought in. And so his birth certificate says Ashley, North Dakota. And then in the summer of 1964, that's when I sold the bowling alley to Ashley Investors, and we moved back to Fargo. Got an apartment on the north side of town, north side of Fargo, and I went to work for Kounovsky Insurance as a claims adjuster. And I didn't really know the difference between, I thought it'd be fun to be a claims adjuster, and I'd kind of thought about being like in the automobile adjusting, but they said, oh, this is a claims adjusting job. Turned out to be health and accident insurance. So I went to work for C.T. Tollefson, worked there for a little over 4 years, and they closed up at that time. Or what happened was Mutual of Omaha, when they started out, they gave lifetime contracts to people that wanted to be an insurance agent for them, and that turned out to be a great deal for all the people that started that. So the company decided when that individual died, because it was a lifetime contract, then they would come and take over the agency. So I was there about 4.5 years, and that's when C.T. Tollefson died. The kids wanted to take over the company. Of course, Mutual of Omaha wouldn't let them. So I was scheduled to work out of my house, which I did for a few months. I didn't really like that setup. So I left there and then ended up going to the North Dakota Automobile Club. So
do you want to say a little bit about the rest of your family and how, when Brian was born in 1968, and then there was another baby that did not make it, right? So you want to talk about Mom and, you guys trying to have kids?
Oh, yeah. When we got back to Fargo, then Lorene had we had a baby born, and he died shortly thereafter. He had a congenital heart condition, is what they told us when he died. And in today's world, of course, they could probably have fixed that, but at that time it was just a congenital heart condition. So
His name was?
And his name was Brett. So then after that, Brian was born in 68, I guess it was. Can't even remember that. But so that's the way the kids came along, and in that, Lorene also had a miscarriage and lost a lot of blood, and in the hospital, they it was in the records that she shouldn't be left alone in the bathroom. Somebody should stay with her. But a nurse put her in there, and then she fell and hit the sink or something and fractured her skull pretty severely. So they came from the Fargo clinic with the doctor and took care of what the doctor had to take care of, and she had to stay 3 days longer in the hospital. And of course, insurance was totally different at that time. You paid by the day for hospitalization and paid for all the stuff that they used up. But when I went down to pay for it, I was really concerned because I didn't have a lot of insurance. And I thought, man, now I got to pay for 3 days on this deal. And I got down, and the gal in the accounting department said, well, they've told me that the Fargo clinic isn't going to charge for any doctor expense, and the hospital decided that because the way the accident happened, they wouldn't charge for those extra 3 days for hospitalization. And I was so happy that I didn't have to pay for that. And if we look at the world from 1967, or I guess it was 67 when that happened. But anyway, if we look at the whole world in between there, if that was today, Denny Sanford would probably come and ask me for a loan because the lawsuit would be so big we couldn't count the numbers. So there's a lot of difference the way it works out.
And that time was different than the time Brett was born, right? That was a different incident, or was that when Brett was born that Mom hit her head?
No, that was when she had just a miscarriage early on. There was no child there. It was just an early miscarriage is all it was.
And when Brett was born and passed away, didn't you tell me a story about the funeral, that Mom wasn't even able to attend the funeral? Or am I wrong?
No, your mother was still in the hospital. We had Hanson Runsvold take care of the funeral, and we just had a burial is what we had at Riverside Cemetery. There wasn't any funeral that your mother couldn't go to. So it was my parents and Al and Roma and the pastor and the guy from the funeral home that actually came to the burial, and that was it.
And Mom was still in the hospital at that time?
Yes, and she was still in the hospital because we had the burial shortly after. I think it was only a day or two, so she was still in the hospital because at that time they stayed in a little longer as far as the hospital was concerned.
Okay, all right. So do you want to talk a little bit now, after you started in your work world here in Fargo, then you started buying houses, right? And the first house that you bought was the one you moved into at 506?
Yeah, 506 22nd Avenue North. We were looking around to buy a house, and of course we looked, and my friend John Berlin had gone to work for Leopard Drywall in West Fargo at the time. That was another classmate of mine. But so John learned all about hanging drywall and finishing drywall. And we found this house at 506 22nd Avenue North, which had been a rental house and been sitting empty. So with the moisture and everything, all of the nails had popped. It looked terrible. And we bought that house for just a little over $10,000. But then John and I went in there and we fixed everything and textured everything, so the house turned out pretty good. And then we lived in there till 71 is when we moved to 1201 First Street North. But that was the first house that I learned anything about fixing houses. And I thought, this is kind of fun to do. So then there was a house that came up for sale on the corner of 10th Street and 5th Avenue South. And for some reason, the bank had set it up where they wanted $7,000 for the house is what they wanted. And it, of course, was in bad shape. But we put our names in a hat. There were only 5 of us that wanted to buy it, and I was drawn out. So then I got to buy the house, and then I went over there and worked on that, and that turned out to be a real good deal, because at that time, of course, I was working at Kounovsky Insurance and getting $350 a month for my job. And by the time I worked all winter to fix up that house and get it on the market, I made almost $3,000 on the house. So that was a heck of a lot better deal than working at the job. So that's when I started buying and remodeling houses. And from there on, I'd have to look to find the exact dates, but I started buying and selling a few. And then when we bought the house we're in now at 1201, as we were looking around, we wanted something bigger for the kids, and this house was, of course, quite a bit more money. And the people that lived here were looking for a smaller house, so Ed Oman, the realtor, he worked out a trade. They moved to our house and we moved here, but of course the problem was going to be that I didn't quite have enough money to make the payments, but I decided I'd remodel 2 houses a year to make up the extra money, and of course I did that. And then I started remodeling at the same time I was working at AAA, and that helped the whole world. And of course then when I went to work at AAA, and that would have been 1969, got to stop and think here, 1969 I guess, or 70, when I went to work at AAA. Then I remember when I was applying for the job and talking to the manager, and he says, well, I'd like to hire you and I'll give you $1,000 a month. And I thought, holy buckets, how could I ever make $1,000 a month? That was just the greatest thing in the world. And so then the first couple of years working for AAA, I took care of, what I did was went to the service stations to make sure they could provide service to the people that needed starts and tows and all that. And we had over 400 service stations across the state of North Dakota that had AAA agreements. So it was my job to go and make sure they took care of all that. And then the AAA nationally started a program to sell tires and batteries. So part of my job then became to sell tires and batteries to these stations. And the whole idea was that AAA members could buy these, they would get them at a little cheaper rate, and the service station would make good money. And one of the good things that happened to me was that I was fortunate enough to work that program, and they measured your sales by the number of members you had. And the number of tires and batteries that I sold in North Dakota put us in second place in the whole United States as sales per member. So then when we would get to go to the national convention, John Wimbush, who was the manager, he would be able to sit up at the head table because we were in that position. So he raised my pay accordingly, and that worked out well. And of course, all during that time, I worked, well then in, I think it was 75, I came into the office then and worked in the office, and somebody else was out on the road. And then I worked on insurance programs, auto insurance, and we created a program called Major Mechanical Breakdown. And that was if you were over 100 miles from home and you had a major mechanical breakdown and you paid, I think it was $3 or $4 extra on your membership, then we would pay for your motel and all of that sort of stuff, car rental and things like that. And that turned out to be a good program. So John Wimbush awarded me a little bit more for that. So I kind of thought, well, should I ever leave this job? But I always wanted to be in my own business as far as being out and about. So that's when I decided that I would buy the Dakota Salvage Pool from a guy he had it in Minneapolis and owned it and was running it with managers here. That wasn't working out well for him, so that's when I bought Dakota Salvage Pool in 1979.
Can we back up just a little bit about your? I know a couple stories I want you to talk about with your remodeling your houses, and one of the stories I always remember is that you thought you bought a house with your cousin David Simley.
Yeah.
And you didn't exactly buy the house, or how did that story work out?
One time, David Simley helped me a little bit on some of the houses, and we thought we'd bought a house that was along 12th Avenue North, and it was on a weekend, and David went over there and knocked out a wall, and we were getting ready to go to fix it up, and then the owner came by and didn't realize that it had gotten sold, and so David was a pretty edgy about that whole deal, but I guess we just packed up and got out of there and we were okay.
And you never bought the house.
And we never bought the house. We just knocked out a wall in the house.
And then the other story that I want you to talk a little bit about is about moving the two houses down to Lake Eunice and how you found those houses and how tough they were.
Oh yeah. Well, one of the things that I did was I wanted to be on the lake, so I found a couple of lots on Lake Eunice down by Audubon, down in that area, and I didn't want to build anything. I wanted to move some houses down there, and at that time they were building a new building out on 13th Avenue South, so I bought two small, they were about 600 square feet houses. So David and I fixed them up, and then we had Ed Oman move them down to Detroit Lake, or to the Lake Eunice. And as that worked out, then my parents bought one of them, and David and I had the other one. And we had that for a few years, and then of course I bought lots on Lake Ida and built a cabin over there in about 1973, I guess, is when I built that one.
Why don't you talk about building that cabin, because I remember that a little bit. I was old enough to remember that, about the foundation you put in. What kind of foundation did you put in on that house?
That was a time when wood foundations were just starting to come out, and you would always wonder why they could stand up. I decided that I was going to do that, so I used a wood foundation and had to had a guy come in and dig a footing 4 feet down, because that was sandy soil, and built a wood foundation. And I had always wanted to have a log type cabin. The end result of that was that I went to Bemidji and found a forester over there that cut, I forgot how many logs it was, but he took them over to the sawmill, and they were slabbed on one side so that I could face that one side out. So then I built the log cabin. It was 32 by 60, and I built it like you would build a steel building. I stood all the logs up, and then put the siding on after that. But I remember one day, and I used to hire guys from the off the street here to go down and help me and shelter and stuff like that. One day Bart had some time off from school, so he rode with me down there, and I took a couple of guys down, and they were working away, and then one would disappear out into the trees there for a little bit. Thought maybe he was using the bathroom out there, but he'd come back, and then Bart came and said, Dad, that guy's got a bottle in his pocket. He didn't realize those guys like to have a little nip as they were working. So that was a big deal for Bart to have a guy taking a little nip out of the bottle. So.
All right. Well, that's about enough time for this time around. Is that okay, Don?
Yeah, that's okay.
All right. Well, that's great. We'll talk more later.